En Montevideo, en el barrio de Buceo, hay una plaza en honor a un primer ministro sueco, Olof Palme, que fue quien ayudó a la mayoría de las personas que escaparon de las dictaduras de Latinoamérica, tanto en Argentina, Chile como en Uruguay. Lo que la mayoría de la gente no sabe es que ese primer ministro, en febrero de 1986, aparece muerto en plena ciudad de Estocolmo. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast where I tell you a story and you learn English. Si querés aprender cómo contar una historia usando there is, there are, there was, there were, there is no, there are no, para poder contar lo que hay o lo que había en un lugar, quédate en este video en YouTube que te cuento toda la historia. So to understand this story very well, we have to go back actually a long time into the past. And first, learn who was Olof Palme. So let me tell you quickly the story about him. Olof Palme was a prime minister in Sweden during the late 70s and 80s who was one of the first social democrats that actually really fought for human rights. And he was a very strong defendant, not only of human rights, but he was also an active character in the political decisions made in the 80s in Sweden towards defending human rights. One of the first things that when you think about Olof Palme, one of the first things that you think about is human rights. Olof Palme was a prime minister from the Social Democrat Party in Sweden who actually defended illegal immigration, who actually was a strong activist for human rights and defended people from Latin America to stop the dictatorships that happened across these regions. Now, the crazy thing is that on February 28 of 1986, Olof Palme and his wife, Lisbeth, were walking down Sveavägen, which is a street very, very populated. He was coming out of the cinema with his wife, and it is a coincidence that there were no bodyguards that night with him as he had decided that he didn't need them. So there were chances that he made this decision and maybe someone alerted somebody else that he was on his own that night. So Olof Palme gets out of the cinema and he starts walking towards his home through Sveavägen. And then out of nowhere, this guy comes from his back, from behind him, shots him several times, and then he runs away. And he runs through a staircase where he is actually seen by some witnesses in the moment, even though it was 11 p.m. already. His wife was injured during this altercation, but she suffered no major injuries. Little after that, first, I have to tell you that this was the first severe crime happening in Sweden that alerted the entire nation, because these things didn't happen in Sweden. Nobody got shot in the middle of the streets, not only in the political field, but in general, it was not common. So there was a lot of speculation about whether this was the start of something terrible that started happening later as terrorism and attacks, political attacks, started happening more often. Perhaps this was definitely the springboard to all of that. So the reasons why this happened, or even the person behind the crime, were never known. There was actually no one implied for the murder of Olof Palme. But there are some crazy theories out there. Let me tell you what those theories are and how they connect to Latin America, to Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. So Olof Palme, as I said before, was a person who was a strong activist for human rights, and he was very opposed to the dictatorships that were happening in Latin America. He was a strong opponent of Pinochet, who was the dictator back then of Chile, and he was completely opposed to the oppression and murders and kidnaps happening around that time. He was outspoken about it and mentioned several times on national air that he was completely open to welcome all the people that were suffering in Uruguay, in Argentina, and in Chile, and across the entire region due to the dictatorships. So he told people, hey, you guys are welcome to Sweden. You can come to our country and you can start your lives in here. We'll protect you. That's who Olof Palme was. And there was no doubt in that moment that he was the one person in Europe defending human rights. Not only was he against the dictatorships of Latin America, Olof Palme was also against what was known as the apartheid. I don't know if you guys know about the apartheid, but quickly speaking, the apartheid was something that happened in South Africa around the same time. And it was this crazy situation where white South African-born people were a minority that was part of the government, actually passed laws that segregated and kept Black South Africans away from most of the rights and most of the decisions that were protecting the South African white population. The apartheid was a regime that was extremely racist, and Olof Palme was altogether with Nelson Mandela, one of the very few people talking that the apartheid had to disappear. So he was a supporter of Mandela, and he was against this regime. So there were several political reasons why Olof Palme was in the eye of the storm, but there wasn't a real reason why somebody would guess that he could be targeted, because nobody really knew if actually until today we still don't know if there was a strong political reason or if this was just an ideology crazy person who decided to end his life. We don't know if this was a political crime. We don't know if this was just an ideological crime, but we know that until today, that murder was never resolved. And let me tell you what are the speculations out there. So there are, obviously, because of these reasons, there's three main theories about Olof Palme's murder. So in 1989, all that police officers had, even if there were thousands of people on the streets the day he was murdered, there were police officers minutes away from the place where he was shot. And there was actually eyewitnesses in the area, including Olof Palme's wife, Lisbeth. They still didn't have any suspects. So then this crazy thing happens. They grab this guy named Christer Petersen, and this was just your average junkie with a background in just minor robberies and really no big records in regards to crime. And they implicate him in the murder. So they made an identification round, which years later was proven to be very, very shady and not very clear, where Olof Palme's wife, Lisbeth, identified this guy in a round of several other people. But it was proven later that this was not 100% sure, and Lisbeth herself later stated that she wasn't actually sure if there was a guy like Christer Petersen really implied in this. So by the 2000s, 2003, 5, he was declared non-guilty actually, and they completely released him from the charges that were against him. So a couple years later, another name appears. In 2020, another man by the name of Stig Engström was found a potential suspect of the crime, but this time this guy could have never been charged because he had died 20 years earlier. Stig Engström actually worked a couple blocks away from where Olof Palme was murdered, and although there were some witnesses, he was actually an implied witness in the case, but he kept changing his story. And because of that, they thought that he could have been guilty of the crime. But actually, there are still no real investigations or evidence connecting him to the crime, just as much as there were no evidences connecting Krister to the crime either. So obviously, because he was dead and because there are really no proofs, no real proof of or evidence of these suspects, they were obviously let go. Until today, Sweden has no clue of what happened in these murders. But there's a line of investigation that was very interesting and nobody talked about. So there was the possibility that the Plan Condor, or Condor Plan in English, was actually involved in the murder of Olof Palme, which actually makes a lot of sense because he was opening the door to most of the immigrants from Chile, from Argentina, and from Uruguay that were escaping the dictatorships. And he was openly speaking against Augusto Pinochet. Apparently, one of the strongest theories that was never actually very investigated was that it's very possible that Pinochet's government, in order to put a stop and silence Olof Palme from keeping talking about the murders and the human rights violations happening around that time, actually decided to silence him by, sending someone to kill him. This was a very, very strong idea, and it could be definitely a potential cause for killing him, but it was a line that was never very investigated. So until today, there were no real facts that could connect these two situations. However, it makes a lot of sense that both the apartheid people and the Plan Condor people could be very involved in Olof Palme's murder. But no one ever knew about how that could be a potential line of investigation because police officers and authorities back then investigated nothing in regards to these two potential lines of investigation. So this was the case that I told you about. I hope you enjoyed the story. Now let's go to analyze the grammar behind this. Como pueden ver, en esta historia les conté muy resumidamente un caso que fue muy sonado en Suecia a finales de los 80 y que tiene mucho que ver con las dictaduras que sucedieron en nuestros países en la misma época. Ahora, para contarles esta historia, yo utilicé una forma gramatical muy específica, que es el uso de there was, there were o there is, there are. Y vamos a ver qué es eso. Entonces, el verbo there is o there are es el verbo haber en español. Y es muy importante que entiendas esto, porque si no sabes usarlo vas a contar mal una historia. Siempre que yo quiera hablar de la existencia de algo, que quiera decir existe, o que quiera decir que hay algo, en inglés tengo que usar el verbo there is o there are. Y esta es la forma de usar el verbo haber. Ahora, ¿cómo sé si tengo que usar there is o cómo sé si tengo que usar there are? Va a depender si lo que estás contando es singular o plural. Si yo estoy hablando de una cosa sola, por ejemplo, there is a man, voy a hablar de singular. Pero si yo estoy hablando de una pluralidad de cosas, voy a usar there are. Por ejemplo, there are many suspects. Entonces digo que hay muchos sospechosos. Estas dos formas son las maneras en las que lo vas a usar siempre. Cuando lo que hablas es una cosa sola, hay o existe una cosa, existe una persona, existe un sospechoso, existe un país, there is a country, there is a suspect, there is a person. Cuando vos hablas de la existencia de varias cosas, existen varias teorías, hay varios testigos, there are several theories, there are several witnesses o there are many witnesses. Y entonces ahí estamos hablando de más de uno. ¿Qué pasa en negativo? Vamos a usarlo como there isn't o there aren't. Entonces, cuando no hay un sospechoso, there isn't a suspect. Cuando no hay testigos, vamos a decir there aren't any eyewitnesses. There aren't any porque no hay ninguno. Entonces, vas a usarlos con la misma estructura. There is cuando tenés una cosa, there isn't cuando no la hay o no existe. There are cuando tenés varias cosas, there aren't o there aren't any cuando no hay ninguna cosa, ¿sí? Y después tenemos un coloquialismo que en inglés es fundamental y que no todo el mundo lo usa, que es el there is no, there are no. Esto lo usamos muchísimo para hablar de la no existencia de algo. Por ejemplo, there is no theory that has been conclusive. O sea, no hay ninguna teoría, no hay teoría conclusiva al respecto. There are no people talking about this in Latin America. No hay gente hablando de esto en Latinoamérica. There are no suspects until today. No hay sospechosos. There are no, there is no. Sigue la misma regla de singular o de plural. Pero en este caso, there is no, y vas a usar automáticamente el sustantivo. There is no suspect. There are no witnesses. ¿Ok? Entonces, en realidad, después del no, viene la cosa de la que estás hablando. En cambio, el there isn't utiliza el artículo a, there isn't a, porque estamos hablando de una cosa, y acuérdense que el artículo a o an significa uno. So there isn't a witness, there isn't a suspect. Esa es la gran diferencia que tenemos. Ahora que los aprendimos, vamos a seguir practicándolos. Cada vez que contás una historia en inglés, vas a hablar de la existencia de las cosas o de lo que había o de lo que hay usando there is, there are en presente, there was, there were en pasado, singular y plural, y there is no, there are no, there was no, there were no, cuando estás hablando en coloquialmente el uso tanto en presente como en pasado. Espero que les haya gustado y nos vemos en la próxima.